Today on the Perception and Action podcast, how can we logically and rationally analyze a practice drill like kicking a soccer ball against a wall so we can improve its representativeness and connect it with what's happening on the field? What are the effects of adding decision-making to practice activities? So it's time for a call to action. Hi, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. Before we get to today's topic, I want to tell you about my new book, Learning to Optimize Movement: Harnessing the Power of the Athlete-Environment Relationship, available now on Amazon in paperback and ebook formats. This book is the follow-up to my best-selling skill acquisition book, How We Learn to Move. In it, I discuss how we can go beyond learning basic coordination to becoming an elite mover, evidence-based principles for learning and coaching optimal movement. Take your game from proficiency to mastery. Now on to the show. Hi, everyone. This is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception Action podcast again. In this episode, I wanted to touch on kind of two things. The first is a controversy that happened on Twitter probably about a month ago now, maybe a little bit longer, in which people were arguing about a practice drill that was posted. And there was a lot, got very heated as usual, and very out of control. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And I want to connect it also to an interesting recent study looking at decision-making in practice and different levels of decision-making. So I'm going to connect these two things. So this activity I was talking about, what it was someone posted a picture of a team practice in soccer. So all the kids were there on the field, ready for soccer practice. And what they were doing was they were all standing in the line, passing the ball off a wall back to themselves. And obviously people, the person posted said this is, they're focusing on technique of passing and receiving the ball, etc. Right. And as I said, people lost their minds on both sides. And what I don't want to do here is I don't want to go into the specifics of this. I'm not going to show you the post. I'm not going to go into the specific comments and reactions. What I want to do instead is I want to show you that there's a much more rational and logical way we can analyze practice drills like this and practice activities and try to understand how we can improve them by making relatively small changes and how they fit together, right? When, practicing at home versus practicing on the field. All right, so that's what I want to try to do. And then, as I said, I'm going to connect this with this new research paper. Okay. So we have this practice activity where a soccer player is practicing passing and receiving the ball by passing it off a wall or surface to themselves, right? That's what they're doing. The way that I like to assess this, and this is something I talk about in the last chapter of my new book, I give you an example of this tool. I like to use kind of my own version of the Representative Practice Assessment Tool, or RPAT. And this was developed in a kind of a series of studies, mostly looking at tennis by Lyndon Krause and colleagues and Damien Farrow and Tim Buzzard and the great group from AIS. And I'll be forthcoming. I was actually involved in this. What he did in his first study was he solicited, while he was developing the tool, he got feedback from a kind of, a expert panel, right? And he, and I was one of them, right? Quote unquote expert panel. And he got us to kind of comment on whether they thought the questions were appropriate and so on, right? So what this is, the representative practice activity is this series of questions that are related to the key concepts of representative design. And you score them on this, and it's really not the number itself. The absolute number is not really that relevant. It's just what's low, what's high, what can we improve, and so on. So let's use this to analyze this passing off the wall, right? So the first question is, does the goal detail a specific purpose? I would give that a 5 out of 5. Yeah. When the people talk about this, they say the reason we're doing this is to improve passing and receiving the ball control. Right. And that's a specific purpose. So that's fine. Right. Whether the task achieves that or not is a different story, but they have a purpose for what they're doing. Number two, is the information used for control what it was like in the game? I would give this a 2, right? It's not nothing, right? The information for passing is not anything like in the game, right? You're not passing to a player's feet or lobbing it, putting it through some defenders. There's no information there for like the specifying information for how you actually control a pass, right? So that is completely lacking in the information for the passing part. The information from the receiving part is of getting the ball when the ball comes back to you, right? It's not completely there. Obviously, you watch the passer pass you the ball. That information is missing. But as soon as it hits the wall, right, it has a tau, it has a bearing angle. It's still a ball coming at you, right? That information is all there, right? So it has something there, right? There's some information that's like in the game. Does the task require the player to make decisions, right? 1 out of 5, which is the lowest score. No, obviously they're passing every time and receiving every time. They don't have any decisions involved at all. Okay. Number 4, does the task require the player to adapt their intentions, right? What they're trying to achieve? No, right? They're told they're passing, right? And receiving. There's no change in what they're trying to do at all. Does the task require the player to adapt their movement solution, right? This is, I would give a 2, right? It's not the lowest, right? There's not much adaptation required because the ball's going to come right back to you. You can pretty much receive it in any way, but there is going to be some variation, right? You might hit the wall in the lower or higher, it might bounce funny, right? You're going to have to adapt how you're receiving the ball. Next question. Does the task provide an appropriate level of challenge for the player? I put this in the middle, could be better, right? This could be challenging for a brand new player, right? Or for a skilled player, it's probably not challenging at all, right? Next one, are the task dynamics, the timing and the force that is what like it required in the game? I would give this a 3 out of 5 for could be better. Again, the passing hardly at all, right? To you, there's no requirement to put a specific force on the pass, a specific direction on the pass, because you're hitting it off a flat surface, right? The actual control of the passing, chipping it, lobbing it, rolling along the ground, there's no requirement from the environment for that, right? So the task dynamics of passing are quite poor, I would argue. The task dynamics of receiving it are pretty good, right? You're still receiving a ball coming at you that you have to control. Obviously, they could be better too, right? You could have a player around you. You could have to receive and then pass as quickly as possible. So there's advantages in that. Last one, does the task induce pressure or emotional reactions in the player? I would argue that this has got to be 1, right? This is boring as heck, I would think, right? There's no real, pressure on you to perform. There's no real excitement here that you're just hitting a ball off the wall, right? So overall, this probably has a fairly low score, right? And which is what brought the ire of a lot of people on the Twitter post, right? It's a pretty low representative task, mostly due to the lack of decision-making, lack of perceiving affordances. The information for the actual passing part of the drill is quite poor, okay? So what I want to do, there's a couple things here, right? So the first one is we have to acknowledge the fact that people are going to practice at home by themselves, right? When I practice at home by myself, I cannot create the same information for passing. I cannot create this emotional pressure. It's very hard to me to create realistic decision making. So should I just not do anything? Should I just stay inside and watch TV until another person can come over, right? No. So I think that's unreasonable to say we'd never do this, right? What we want to do is realize that in certain situations, there's some of these things on the RPAT tool are going to be completely impossible to achieve, right? I can't achieve, the correct information without another person, the specifying information. So in that situation, what I'd rather do is focus on improving the things that I can instead of completely saying this drill is useful and throwing it away, right? So first of all, one of the things we can do is the one question, does it require the player to adapt their movement solution? We can make this much better by using an uneven surface, right? Having them pat where the ball is going to do unpredictable bounces and things like that. So you have to adapt to things. We could vary our distance, our angle, right? We could have something where sometimes we pass it to, we could put a net behind it and have sometimes where you hear a number or something. In one situation, you pass it, one situation, you shoot it, right? Obviously, that's not game-like, right? You're probably surprised, but to me, I think you have to accept the nature of the situation, right? If I'm going to be playing at home in my backyard, there are certain constraints, right, that I cannot get over, right? And to me, to throw out the drill and say it's completely useless because it can't be perfectly representative of the real soccer is not very smart. And that's one of the things that sometimes scares me about the idea of representativeness, that we have to have maximal representativeness all the time. I don't agree with that, right? We can move away from fully representative for specific purpose, and also in specific situations where it's not achievable, some of these things on the scale. Obviously, this is a completely different story when we're actually come to practice, right? When we come to practice on a soccer field and there's other players, there's a net, there's a goalkeeper in the field, we do have the opportunity to add decision making, change in intention, change of adaptation, and make the the action fidelity better. So that is what kind of makes people upset, right? The idea that you are wasting practice time by not taking advantage of the fact that you could push all these representative numbers up when you get and I agree with that, right? Because most people, if they brought this actual drill to practice on a team practice, they would argue that the reason they're doing it, the reason why they have to do it in the practice session themselves, right, instead of just telling players to do it at home, is they want to give technical feedback about how to control the drill, right? Which obviously is not kind of my way to do it. So I kind of agree with the sentiment. I don't think this is overall an effective use of team practice time, right? Where there's things these on this representative practice assessment tool that we could massively bump up, right? If we have the opportunity when we have other players around, and right. And then there's the expression I've used a few times on the podcast. So you can, in this picture, you have a person passing off this special wall, right? That's a practice tool. And there's lots of practice tools out there, right? And the expression I like to say is the best practice tool ever invented for sports is another player, right? There's nothing else that can be better. No flashing lights or beeping sounds or walls or whatever. Other players are the best thing we have, right? And you can constrain the other player so they have to pass only in certain ways and they can't do really hard passes. And we've talked all about that, unfortunately. But the bottom line is, I hope that people kind of take, instead of having these emotional reactions and accusing people of all these things and blah, 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 just take a rational assessment. I think this representative practice assessment tool, as I said, I talk more about in my new book, is a great place to start. And it just gives you a way to think about, okay, how can I change this? How can I improve this representative, this part and that part? And realizing that people are going to practice at home and things like that. So we're going to leave that. Okay. So that's the first part of the month. What I wanted to do next was to talk about a related study, right? So there's this interesting new study come out by Coutinho and colleagues called Exploring the Effects of Tasks with Different Decision-Making Levels on Ball Control, Passing Performance, and External Load in Youth Football. So I thought this was a nice connection because they're going to evaluate soccer drills in terms of that one particular component we were emphasizing in the RPAT, decision-making. So in their background, they recognize that there's a strong tendency to focus on technique. Okay, and in the idea that we spend most of our practice focusing on drills with no decision making at all. You're passing to a person the coach has told you to pass to. You're standing in lines passing, and then we play the games at the end. Okay, and everyone by now knows this is getting more and more criticism, because it's decoupling perception for action. There's no multiple affordances available, blah, blah, blah. Right? I'm not going to go through all that again. They also, the alternative, of course, most people promote in soccer specifically, but in other sports like basketball, hockey, etc., is small-sided games. Okay. And they recognize, there's been research on small-sided games showing the benefits. But one of the things, surprisingly, there's not a lot on actually evaluating decision-making specifically. A lot of it is on how small-sided games develop passing ability, shooting ability, etc. Okay, so there's this growing understanding of these different training conventions, but to quote this, for instance, despite game-based situations having been suggested as practices that may be more relevant to prepare players to act during competitive performances, coaches of youth players still spend a vast amount of time using prescriptive and repetitive tasks, right? So this common theme that, yes, we're pushing these small-sided games, showing some of the benefits of them, but people are still going back to kicking out off walls in practice, as opposed to tasks that involve decision-making. So what they wanted to do in this study was to kind of provide some further support for the benefits of things like small-sided games by showing how they improve and affect things specifically related to decision-making, creating space, things like that. And what they're going to have is they're going to train people under 3 different tasks: low, moderate, and high decision-making. They're going to call them, and I'll explain these in detail in a second. They're going to look at how this transfers to performance. Okay, so obviously they're expecting the high overall, the decision making to be better, right? Low decision making is going to kind of hurt people's ability to find open players, move the ball well, right? Because it's not giving them opportunities to perceive these affordances. So, those are kind of the basic ideas they're looking at. So they're overall just basically predicting that overall the high decision making training is going to result in better ball control, better decision making, better passing, all these kind of things. Okay, so what did they actually do? So they took 20 youth male players, age about 12, 13, from a Portuguese club, so relative unexperienced, not a ton of experience. They did kind of an interesting thing that, for me, to foreshadow, is kind of problematic for me. They did kind of 2 things. So what they did was they used within subjects design. So all 20 of them trained under low, moderate, and high decision-making things. Okay. So what they did for this, they used a standard pre-post design. So they played a small-sided game in which their performance was evaluated, which I'll talk about in a second in terms of passing, shooting, etc. Then they trained under one of these conditions. Then they played the small-sided game again, right? And then they looked at how the differences between the pre and post performance in the small-sided games, how it depended on what they did in between. Okay, and as I said, they did this for everybody. So it's a within subjects design, and across 7 weeks, they all experienced all of these conditions. They were randomized in order, right? So every session you would do a low, medium, moderate, high in random order, measure before and after, before and after, before and after for each, right? So importantly, they're really measuring what they call the acute effects. So what's the immediate effect right after you do a high decision-making practice on what you do immediately after, you perform immediately after. They're not really evaluating long-term training effects, retention effects, transfer effects like that we typically see, right? Because they're not looking at those things. They're only measuring these immediate effects, okay? So that's going to be important later on. I'll get to that. They did give players some general instructions about, orient your body to the ball when you're receiving, look for players' distance when you're judging the pass, but no real technical instructions, okay? So that's the basic design. So as I said, they're going to do the pretest is a small-sided game. It's 4-on-4 with goalkeepers, right? Just a normal small-sided game. They play that for 6 minutes. Then they do one of the training interventions. We'll talk about each of them in a second. And then they do the same 4-on-4 small-sided game afterwards, right? So every week they're doing this every session they're doing 3 of these, right? So they're doing 6 small-sided game, some kind of intervention, small-sided game, then they're doing other ones, okay? So everybody's getting every kind of training, okay? The low decision-making, so let's go into each of the training. The low decision-making training involved basically standing in a square and passing the ball around the square. So you're receiving the ball from another player, but you know exactly where it's coming from and exactly where you have to pass it. Right? And the focus was on the rhythm, getting the ball going around, right? So it's coordinated passing, no decision-making involved, right? You know exactly what you have to do with the ball before you receive it, okay? So that was the first, that's the low decision-making. The moderate decision-making was basically the players were standing in a circle and 4 players, and there were 2 balls, and they were passing it around. And basically they we're told, pass the ball to a person that doesn't have a ball, right? So what they try to have to avoid having a person have two balls at once, right? So obviously there's some decision making here involved, right? You have to decide who to pass to based on where the ball is. They call that moderate decision making. Obviously, it's kind of ungame like, right? You don't make decisions about passing based on where the ball is, right? You have the ball when you're passing, so it's kind of a moderate one, right? And then the last one was basically kind of a small sided game. You had a 3-on-3. It was 3-on-3 with two neutral players that could support either the defense or the offense. The 3-on-3, basically their goal was to maintain the ball, maintain possession, right? So obviously there's a lot of decision making here. Who do I pass the ball to on my team? Do I dribble it? Do I pass it? Right? So it's very high decision making. Okay, so those are the three. And remember, everybody's doing all of these every session. What do they measure? So they use this tool, the game performance evaluation tool. It's basically when a scorer watches people perform in a small-sided game and looks at every play they make, right? And they give a score of 0 to 1 based on their performance, their execution, their decision-making. So if I passed a ball to you and it bounced off your feet and went away, you'd get a 0 for receiving execution, right? If you tried to pass, if I'm wide open and you try to pass the ball to me, but you miss me, you get a 0 for a passing execution, but you get a 1 for decision making, right? Because I was clearly open, right? So someone's watching the video, scoring all this, and it's either a 0 to 1. They scored a total of almost over 900 actions. And importantly, for these kind of designs, they had 2 observers. So they took a subset of the whole thing and had a second scorer do them. And they looked at how close they corresponded, and it was between 0.83 and 0.94, whereas 1 is the maximum, right? So that's quite good, right? You're never going to get perfect agreement, but that's quite good, and it's important that they do that. And they also had GPS units on people running around and looking at how much they measure. Okay. Okay. So that's what they're measuring. What did they find? Okay. Their findings are quite modest. I'll be on all these different things. They basically looked at the differences between pre and post, and they compared the different conditions, right? Remember, this is immediately after you're doing the drill. And so they looked at execution, what was your body oriented to the right, the ball, decision-making, all these things. And they basically found 3 significant differences. After training in the moderate decision-making task, there was a decrement in your ability to identify offensive players that were open. After the high decision-making task, there was an increased ability to receive the ball towards the space. And finally, in the ball control variables were mostly lower in the low decision-making task as compared to the moderate, right? So some things, but not quite what you would expect, right? If you really believe this importance of, and their hypotheses, like you don't see consistent differences between low and high on all these variables, right? It's kind of just a subset of these variables that came out significant. But there's something there, and it's kind of in the direction that you would expect, right? So what do the authors conclude? The authors conclude that these training tasks can be used to increase the frequency of technical actions. What they found they did find some evidence of lower transfer, right? The performance in the small-sided game after the ability to find open players, the ability to execute passes was not as good. There was some evidence that was not as good after low decision-making tasks. They also, by the way, found evidence for less movement, obviously, in the low decision-making tasks in terms of the GPS, how much different. And so they concluded, here's a quote, overall prescriptive tasks, that is low decision-making tasks that are repetitive in nature, may affect players' perceptual attunement, whereas static tasks, moderate decision-making, may limit their ability to locate players in more offensive positions. Moreover, game-based situations, high decision-making, seem to be acutely enhance players' performance, possibly due to the contextual dependency. Right, so we're giving them more opportunities to make decisions, more perceive affordances, perceive openings, right? So this kind of on the surface supports, what we're talking about, the criticism of kicking off walls, which is obviously a 0 decision-making task. Okay, so that's kind of their conclusions. My conclusions, I'm not as really I think this is enthusiastic about the results as the authors are. To find just kind of these 3 random kind of differences and all those things is not is not super strong evidence, I think, in the clear benefits of high decision making. Now, there's some things there, but it's not overwhelming. I think but I think what they found actually is not surprising to me at all. I'd be worried if they found difference, what they were looking for. Why? Because within subjects, first of all, acute effects are a small-sided game is playing the long game, right? We're trying to improve you over the long term. We don't expect a lot of immediate things right away, right? Those are going to be fairly small, so they're hard to find. Second, within subjects design, think about it. So in some of the training sessions, you're going to do the low decision-making condition after you've already done the high decision-making. And then each day, you're going to do the low decision-making, and you've done 3 days before of high decision-making. If we got the low decision when always bad, that would be terrible. That would mean the high decision-making we've done the day before or the few minutes before had no stickiness, right? It didn't have any impact on you in the long term. It didn't help your skill over the long term. There's going to be massive carryover effects in this kind of design, right? Once you practice the high decision-making, hopefully it changes your ability, it changes your attunement, changes your information movement control that sticks, right? And it's going to stay there and be there no matter what you do next day, whether you do a low, right? So that's the idea. So I'd be surprised. I would be worried if we got clear differences here. Another issue I think people might point out is, essentially the high decision-making task is a small-sided game, right? And the test they're doing is a small-sided game, a 4-on-4 versus a 3-on-3 right? So it's very near transfer, right? It's essentially measuring the same thing, just a different variant. So I think people might say, of course, you get better results from the high decision-making. It's basically the same type of task, right? A small-sided game. So I think there would be a bit of criticism there. So overall, I like this idea of doing this, but I think looking for acute effects in a within subjects design is probably not the best way to go, right? But I think, what they did find does support kind of why we push for having decision-making using other players in practice. But the bottom line, what I want to emphasize today as a take-home message, right? I think, each of our practice activities, I think we can analyze them and more importantly, improve them in a very logical and rational way by using tools like the RPAT, the Representative Practice Assessment Tool. And if you want to have a look up for that paper, you can find it online. It's free to adapt. What I want to focus on, what can we improve, right? If we're going to play at home in our backyard when no kids are available, what can we do to improve that? How can we add some variability? How can we change your decisions maybe, right? Instead of just throwing the baby out with the bathwater and saying, never do that, right? That's not the right way to go. And then at the same time, though, when we get to practice on the field, being more effective and taking better use of practice time by bumping up those representative variables that we can't do at ourselves by our home. Look, particularly giving people perceived affordances for passing, shooting, dribbling the ball, and making decisions. We can't do those at home, and making the information more specifying, right? Passing a ball to a player with a defender in between, for example, right? You have to perceive how the task dynamics of passing are going to change in that way. Right. So hopefully, you kind of appreciate kind of this approach. Okay. So thanks for joining me. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including 2 monthly coaches meetups, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.